That's great. Okay, guys, so let's get started. There'll be more people joining the call periodically as we go, but I'm very excited about today. Ben and I met, as you can hear, in 2021. It was quite a while ago. We got introduced through a really dear friend, and I've been following everything that he's been doing in his career for a while, which is honestly incredible, the work that you've done. I'm going to embarrass him a little bit and read his bio, even though he doesn't want me to, but I'm going to share a little bit about his background. So, Ben Goldsmith he's a British financier, environmental philanthropist, leading advocate for nature restoration. He's the CEO of Menhaden Capital Management, an investment firm focused on sustainability and resource efficiency. He's the co-founder of WHEB Asset Management. He also chairs the JMG Foundation and serves as a trustee of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, one of the world's largest climate-focused philanthropic funds. In 2018 to 2022, he was a non-executive director of the UK Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he's the founder and chair of the Conservation Collective, a global network of local foundations dedicated to rewilding and ecosystem restoration. So could you share with us a little bit about how your passion for rewilding started?
Sure, Adria, thank you so much for having me on this call. And yeah, I had a little bit of a story to tell. Would you like me to do that? And how
Yeah,
long would you like me to do that
absolutely.
for?
So the call will be structured in, 20 minutes you have to talk about whatever you want, and then people can ask questions. If they want, just raise your hand as he's chatting. This is very casual. It's all friends here. So
Okay. Well, I think, and David was going to speak about this as well, but I think the world is undergoing a profound cultural shift right now in respect of our relationship to nature. We all grow up with a love of nature, a fascination for wildlife. Anyone who's looked after small children will know that they are fascinated by a frog or a bird's nest with blue eggs in it or a butterfly. Children want to be outside more than anything else, interacting with the natural world. And I think in many people, as they grow up, that love of nature falls somewhat dormant. And in others, in my case, it remains front and center. But I don't think in anyone it fades away completely. The writer E.O. Wilson coined a term, biophilia, to describe the innate love that all humans have for the non-human world. We love our dogs. We will pay twice the price for an apartment which overlooks the park versus one that doesn't. When the sun comes out in London, people pile into the parks and want to be in contact with the nature that they can find within the city. We have this kind of yearning somewhere on some level to be close to nature. And I think right now we're going through a period in which the importance of that connection with nature is becoming more and more relevant. And there is a growing yearning. And just at this moment where people are yearning for a greater connection with nature, they're finding that nature is pretty threadbare, especially in places like my country in Britain, which is one of the most nature depleted countries on Earth. We're out of 196 countries on the planet, we're in the bottom 10 in terms of ecosystem intactness. So in this country and beyond, there is a kind of upwelling of love for nature and a growing demand that we restore nature. And yesterday we had this comprehensive spending review. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is the British Finance Minister, stood up and announced the biggest ever investment in nature recovery, somewhere in the region of £8 billion between now and 2028, which is just completely mind-boggling for someone like me that's been watching the politics of nature recovery all my adult life. In the old days, you'd get the Chancellor of the Exchequer throwing at the very end of the budget £1 million for planting trees in the north, or some token sum to keep the tree huggers happy. Well, now it's absolutely central to politics in this country. The state of the environment is shifting elections. And why this is, I don't know. Why has this cultural shift taken place? Maybe it was the lockdowns. We started our conversation talking about the lockdowns. I think those drove a lot of people quite crazy, but they also forced people to stay in their place. They forced people to find nature, to find recreation, to find tranquility where they live. They weren't able to hop on a plane for a mini break in Rome or whatever. They had to go and find that little patch of wildflowers, that bird song near their own house. And I think that may have played a part. But also science is giving us, with every passing year, little glimpses of this importance of nature in our lives. For example, prisoners in a trial in California were shown, if they were given a few hours each week to grow their own potatoes, have their hands in the soil, to sit beneath the blue sky, a few hours each week interacting with the natural world, they were less depressed, they were more healthy, they were less violent, and ultimately they were less prone to reoffending. Hospital patients, if they can just see nature through their hospital window, according to Japanese studies, get better meaningfully faster. And of course, children, with any kind of behavioral difficulties, get them outside, all problems evaporate. So we know that the trees emit compounds. That when we walk through the forest, they slow our heart rate, they reduce our blood pressure, they make us feel happy. We know, we get glimpses, but we don't really understand the importance. But there is this societal yearning now. Pick up any magazine, any book, switch on the TV, go on social media, and you'll find that how many people you know have got a mindfulness app on their phone. The other part of this cultural shift is economic. There's a growing understanding of the quantifiable value of nature to society. So it's all very well saying we love nature, we want to spend time in nature. Who's going to pay to set aside land from other uses and to restore it to wild nature? Who's going to pay for that? Well, there is a growing understanding now that healthy ecosystems do things for society that is worth money. So, for example, if you restore nature, wetlands, gently meandering streams reconnected with their floodplains, ponds, in a particular part of the river catchment, in the hills, say, you create a sponge, a giant natural sponge that absorbs rainfall and releases the water slowly throughout the year. So you're protecting communities downstream from flash flooding in the winter, and you're providing them with a steady supply of clean water in the summer. New York City, for example. New York City has the world's largest unfiltered water supply on the planet. Now, the water for New York City comes unfiltered from the Catskill Mountains. If you pay a water bill in New York City, a tiny proportion of your water bill goes towards subsidizing the protection of that forest in the Catskills, because it's far cheaper for the city than building a huge concrete water treatment plant and so on, storage and all of that. The forest is the cheapest and the most effective way to deliver the city with clean water. So that's just one example of the kind of things that are now being recognized in economic decision making. So the authorities in the UK, the Environment Agency, the flood insurers, the water companies are now actively paying hundreds of millions of pounds to landowners in sensitive parts of the river catchments in the UK to restore wetlands, to restore that sponge landscape. So there is now money flowing into nature recovery from business, from investors, and delivering nature recovery in this country on a scale that's never really been seen before. Another example is carbon sequestration. Companies from Meta and Amazon through to GlaxoSmithKline, through to the airlines, the shipping companies, they want to reduce their carbon emissions, and in parallel, they want to offset that which they can't eliminate. And the way that they offset it is by buying nature-based carbon credits. So if you restore, a wetland in Louisiana, or a salt marsh in the San Diego River Basin, or you restore an upland rainforest in Wales, you can now measure with a tremendous degree of precision the amount of carbon that ecosystem will capture from the atmosphere and lock away. And you can sell that carbon, $100 a ton, $150 a ton. It's a multi-billion-dollar market now, this nature-based carbon market. And because there's been some reputational issues and there's been some cowboys in the market, there's been a shakeout, and only the highest quality projects are now able to sell their credits. So again, the flood mitigation, clean water, nature-based carbon, biodiversity credits, and a whole bunch of markets are growing up in which people are being rewarded by the private sector for restoring nature. So I think that when I talk about this profound shift that's taking place, it's a cultural or a spiritual shift as well as an economic one. And it's a matter of life or death, of course. We have a climate problem, but the climate problem is only part of it, or only symptomatic of a greater destruction of nature. And rebuilding nature is I think the greatest imperative that our generation has, and the biggest opportunity we have, because it's profoundly joyful. It's a profoundly joyful thing to do. I'm taking this call right now from my little farm in Somerset. We have 430 acres here that used to be suspiciously electric green, chemically fertilized dairy pasture without much in the way of wildlife or birdsong. neatly cropped fields. The kind of landscape you see when you fly into Gatwick Airport, and a foreigner will think, "Wow, the lush green fields of England, so rich in nature, so vibrant." And in fact, they've been utterly drained of invertebrates, of songbirds, of wildflowers. It's a desperately depleted landscape. And this place in Somerset was no different, except that this place is also agriculturally unproductive. So I started rewilding this land, and it is pure magic. The reawakening of
Hey,
nature.
Ben, could I ask a question? If you were to like for us novices, if you were to define rewilding, what would that be? And what is it to you?
Yeah. So rewilding is the most cost-effective way to restore nature at scale. Because instead of trying to deliver prescribed outcomes through traditional conservation, you're letting a self-willed nature recovery take place by simply restoring natural processes. So here in Somerset, I could have said, I want marsh fritillary butterflies, a red listed species that's on the brink of extinction. They used to be here, they're not here anymore. So I will micromanage the land to benefit marsh fritillary butterflies. Rewilding is the opposite of that. Rewilding is about restoring keystone natural processes and seeing what happens, safe in the knowledge that tremendous natural abundance will follow. You just don't know exactly how and in what proportion or what's going to happen. It's kind of unpredictable. It's self-willed. So in Britain, there are four keystone natural processes on which everything else depends. And there are four species. And the first is native cattle. So historically, this island was grazed by hundreds of thousands or even potentially millions of aurochs, the big horned wild cattle, the ancestors of all cows today in the world, was the European aurochs, or earlier still, European bison. And what they do is they graze and they browse and they trample and they create a mess. They create disturbance. And in the wake of that disturbance, you get these extraordinary semi-open dynamic savanna woodlands that are just heaving with life. In the absence of those cattle, you get an overgrowth of vegetation and it becomes a dark forest, which is not great for wildlife. The second is pigs, which rootle and turn over the soil and create space for the more delicate plants and trees to germinate and space for birds to feed and so on. We have turtle doves here. They're beautiful, beautiful migratory dove, and they're dependent upon the rootling of pigs or their wild ancestors, the wild boar. The third is beavers, which across the Northern Hemisphere are the most important keystone of all because they build little dams using the sticks they cut from trees, and they create these extraordinary ribbon wetlands. They look like Japanese rice terraces, and those pools of water are just havens. Have you ever seen Fantasia, that Disney film? It's like the beavers do what those wizards do. They kind of wave a magic wand and create these extraordinary water wonderlands. And then the fourth is wolves, which we don't have here in Somerset, but the wolves keep control of the numbers of beavers and pigs and deer, and they keep everything in check, and they are absolutely vital. We have a guy called Derek who wears camo and has a rifle, which is kind of sort of as good, but not quite. So you put those natural processes back in place, put back the bison or domestic native cattle, put back the wild boar or domestic hardy pigs, put back the beavers, keep control of deer and deer numbers and so on, and then nature lets rip. And we're 4 or 5 years in, and we have glowworms, and we have new species showing up every week. We have wildcats, we have pine martens, we've got little pockets of dog rose and scrub coming up everywhere. And the bird song is so thick between February and June here that you can feel it in your bones, first light and last light. So it's a profoundly joyful thing, making space for nature, and nature knows how to heal itself. You just have to step back and allow those natural processes to play out. It's a hell of a lot cheaper than trying to do it the traditional way. So I think rewilding is the movement of the moment. It's hugely popular, not just here, but increasingly worldwide. And it's also becoming economically viable. So as an investor, I spent the first 15, 20 years of my life investing in renewables and water infrastructure and kind of green investments more generally. We raised a $2 billion asset management business focused just on that. I now find that my great love, my childhood love of nature and wildlife, the thing that I care most about above all else, is now coalescing with my experience in finance. So I'm now devoting myself to the financing of nature recovery as an investable asset class. And I think this is a
Can
very
you share a little bit
exciting.
about how you do that, Ben? Like, do you have a process behind, like,
Yeah.
for us to understand?
So I think there's parallels between nature as an infrastructure asset class and solar. I mean, I don't know if people remember, but in 2005, say, when I started out, Now, solar was considered something of a kind of rich person's hobby. I had an uncle who I adored, who was a kind of environmental guru called Teddy Goldsmith, and he put two solar panels on his roof. They cost a fortune. They didn't work. He was ripped off by contractors. He couldn't get plugged into the grid, but he did it anyway. And over time, solar went from being a kind of hobby to being the most mainstream of infrastructure asset classes. In fact, no category of infrastructure has ever received a greater quantity of investment faster than solar. The scale up of solar has been way beyond even the most radical forecasts. It's the cheapest source of power the world's ever known, and you'll find solar in every institutional portfolio. So I think nature is similar. I think the idea of nature as the mother of all infrastructure, as a whole category of infrastructure in its own right, is very new, but it's emerging fast and is now attracting billions of dollars of capital. And so what I did was I raised 40 million pounds of institutional capital last year. I started a business called Nattergal, which is the Danish for nightingale, as it happens, because the nightingale, which sings at night, doesn't just sing in Berkeley Square, so the song goes. It sings in rewilded landscapes and is a symbol really of rewilding. This nighttime bird song is, as an aside, the noise at night returning on my land is unbelievable. England is a place that has silent nights. If you cross the channel, go to France or Italy, you hear, you go out at night and come back to find your accommodation, and you hear like rah, frogs and crickets and singing nightingales and owls, and it's just alive. Whereas England is silent at night. And the noise flooding back into this landscape here in Somerset at night is really staggering. People think they're in Africa when they come and sit around the fire here. But so I set up a business called Nattergal, Nightingale. We raised 40 million pounds of institutional capital, and we bought 3 large properties, each one roughly the size of 2 Central Parks, all three within 2 hours of London, and they're all 3 ecologically bankrupt. In other words, basically dead zones, and they're all 3 economically bankrupt. In other words, no longer farmable. And we are restoring wild ecosystems on each of those landscapes. So we are using rewilding to restore natural process-led nature, and we are selling services that nature provides. So we just sold £1 million worth of nature-based carbon credits to Arup, the industrial company. We just sold £1 million worth of regulated biodiversity credits to Bellway Homes, one of the UK's largest house builders. We are selling natural flood management services to Norfolk County Council. It's the cheapest way to protect communities downstream from flooding is to hold the water back in the landscape by recreating wetlands and restoring beavers. So we are selling services, tokens, in those broadly in those categories: biodiversity credits, carbon credits, and natural flood management and clean water. And the idea is to prove that these pieces of land can deliver a kind of infrastructure-like financial yield. 4, 5, 6% annual yields are better than you get from student accommodation or office blocks in Canary Wharf or water infrastructure or toll roads or bridges, and they're performing a useful societal purpose. So that we are building one of the first natural capital businesses that uses rewilding as its modus operandi in the UK. That's how I've approached this, Adria, who we've lost.
That's phenomenal. I want to ask, because we're almost at the 20-minute marker, if anybody wants to jump in and have a question. Does anybody want to share anything or make an anecdote?
I would love to. There's been a process of rewilding a number of food forests. Hi, sorry, I'm Alicia. Nice to see everyone today. Thank you, Ben. What an incredible thing that you're doing in London. There's a number of food forests. I'm based in Hawaii a lot of my time, and the food forestry development through rewilding processes integrated with permaculture has been quite profound in the tropical and subtropical regions. And I'm interested in knowing more, and perhaps maybe we can talk about this offline regarding the use and transfer viably and functionally of credits, right? Carbon credits or otherwise, because I know that's been a huge holdup and problem within the context of all of the incredible work that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, small scale productive rewilding is fantastic. I mean, I was chair of the Rewilding London task force, and part of that was about establishing more allotments and more orchards, community orchards and so on, as well as creating wild places within streaks and patches of wild nature within the fabric of London itself. And I mean, if you visit London or if you live in London, go and have a look at Hyde Park, Regent's Park, basically any green space, and you'll find these pockets of scrub and restored wetlands popping up everywhere. There's a white stork reintroduction taking shape on the Thames estuary. You know, the last pair of white storks to nest in London would have been in the 13th century. So there's some really cool stuff happening within cities and towns, and usually they are pegged to some kind of productivity. So I've heard the term agri-wilding, where you are effectively restoring natural process-led nature, but gardened by humans, because we are, of course, a keystone species. I thought about saying there are 5 keystone natural processes, and including humans, but it doesn't fit quite right. But I think that is broadly accurate. And in terms of carbon, well, it's taking shape. You know, there are those who have a problem with market-based mechanisms as a way of solving problems, but we've seen with solar that done right, the market can provide solutions, and there's nowhere else we're going to get the scale of money we need. And with the scale of restoration that's needed, there's 10 million acres of degraded former mining land in India alone. I mean, there's enormous amounts of nature that needs restoring. Restoring things like coral reefs and seagrasses requires people to swim down and actually plant things in the seabed. So we need a lot of money. And there aren't enough generous philanthropists out there, and governments are going bankrupt all over the world. There is not enough money. So we need to harness private finance, which means we need to make carbon work one way or another. And I believe the work of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, his voluntary carbon market integrity initiative and so on are really vital. And I think it will take shape. But in the meantime, we've got things like flood mitigation, clean water. These are massively important already in the US. Huge wetlands being restored using private finance in order to solve societal problems such as flooding and drought. So I think we're living in an exciting time, and I can't think of any job that any of you might have that don't offer you the scope in some way to participate in this moment of restoration. Whatever that might be, I think any job has scope in which to provide opportunities to participate. And I strongly urge you to do that. And if you're rich enough, buy a few acres and actually live in them and do it yourself. You know, sell up your urban house and go to the suburbs and have 20 acres and do that.
Thank you, Ben. That's incredible. If you can stay towards the end, I think the folks probably want to ask maybe a couple more questions to you, because we'll do an open Q&A at the end. But now I'd like to introduce David, who I think you know anyway.
Very well.
Yeah.
David was my childhood hero because he's 2 or 3 years older than me, and we grew up together.
I know, I figured. So when I asked both of you, I was like, well, it makes sense. They're friends. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. I was just listening to this beautifully poetic rewilding. I feel like I've been listening to a calm app. I was in with when you were talking so beautifully, Ben, about all the different species that have returned to your land. It's absolutely amazing to hear. And all I know is I'm glad that you're fighting the good fight for us. And thank you to everybody for turning up to listen to both of us, and nice to see so many faces.
Absolutely. Since I talked to you guys last, because we met during the pandemic, and then things grew a lot, and then the Vine actually grew to about 11,000 people now from 70 countries. And it's actually going to be merging into something new. So I'll be closing the Vine and then rebirthing it, and then I'll share with you guys privately about that. It'll be a lot more focused. But for now, I'd really love for the family offices and the Vine to support both of your work. It takes a lot of effort, energy, and capital to make these things happen. So hopefully I can connect you with some meaningful relationships after this call, and thank you for letting me record it so that I can forward it and share it with some other folks who couldn't make it today. But I want to introduce you and maybe embarrass you a little bit and read your bio as well. So if you don't mind, I would like to introduce you properly. David is a renowned British environmentalist, adventurer, and founder of the Lost Explorer and Voice for Nature Foundation, whom I met you through Katie, who you've worked with for a very long time, and we love her and the Vine. He's best known for leading high-profile expeditions that spotlight environmental issues, including Plastiki, a boat constructed from 12,500 recycled plastic bottles, which brought global awareness to ocean plastic pollution. David has traversed both the Arctic and the Antarctic and launched several pioneering sustainability ventures, including Adventure Ecology and Mapped.it. Through his books, documentaries, TEDx talks, he's inspired global audiences and earned recognition from National Geographic, the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum as a leading voice in environment advocacy and sustainability. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and excited. I have a million questions, but maybe could we go back in time and maybe just start, like, where did all of this start? Like, at what point did you have an aha moment where you're like, I want to dedicate my life to this? Because your life could have gone in a lot of different directions, but you're very inspiring. So
it's always completely uncomfortable. It's a bit like when, you know, happy birthday. I feel like bios being read is like someone singing you happy birthday. It's profoundly uncomfortable. So that's what I feel like I've just been through. So thank you for making me feel uncomfortable. But you know, I think it all started with just an absolute inability to sit still. And I think as a kid, I was you know, just as all kids are. You know, I have 3 young children under the age of 5, and what they have in abundance is you know, this natural curiosity, a way of looking at the world that, unfortunately, as we grow older, is learned out of us by a number of different factors, socioeconomic, timing, you know, geographical, etc. You can go through the list of things, but fundamentally, what's often what happens to us is that the education system that we're put into, if we're lucky enough to be in an education system, you know, often we're taught what we can't do. Rather than what we can do. And Sir Ken Robinson, who is obviously an incredible speaker on education, would often talk about this and would use this analogy of walking into a classroom of kids, and you ask them who can sing, who can dance, who can draw, you know, fill in the blank. Everyone will put their hand up. And you do the same in a group of university students, and maybe one person puts their hand up, and one person puts their hand up. You know, if they're brave enough, you know, and what it shows you is as we grow older. And I was saying to this someone the other day, we tend to get stiff, right? We get rigid. I mean, we physically get rigid, but our neural pathways get rigid, right? We actually see, and it's interesting, as you get older, you get called an expert, and isn't that ironic? Because usually when you're an expert, you get really good at something, and that really good at something pushes you into, you know, into a lane, and then often within that lane, we get really nuanced. And, you know, people often, when you talk about the environment, and I remember this many years ago, this was kind of, you know, to get back to your question, the segue, but was people often say, you know, oh, you're an environmentalist. So what's your cause? You know, it's an odd phrase, my cause. Okay, well, it's a shared cause. But, you know, you say, well, you know, what are you into? Are you into oceans? Are you into trees? Are you into, you know, and you say, oh, you know, I'm into everything. No, but you must be into something. There must be something you're into. And we love specialists. And to me, I've really kind of thrived, I think, just being a jack of all trades and a master of none. And to me, my greatest mentor has been nature, and that's you know, really the sort of the endless story that is this 4.5 billion years of evolution that we're, you know, with the recipients of, is something that I've you know, gravitated towards. And you know, I think as a kid I was just far more comfortable, and Ben mentioned it earlier, but you know, when you spend time in nature, you go back to you know, either consciously or unconsciously, you go back to that state of being that we all, you know, either crave, but that state of being of where we are, who we are, because we are nature, right? We've created this false dichotomy in that there is this sort of this separation. And so part of my education was training in natural medicine. And when you really look at the parallels between you know, the state of the oceans, and you look at the oceans as our sort of global climate conveyor belt, you know, they really are similar to our cardiovascular system in our body. When you look at like the denaturing of all the soil, you know, because of massive agribusiness, you know, that is akin to the gut flora and fauna. And as we take on food today that is denatured or is highly processed, it's had a massive effect on our gut flora and fauna. It's quite a tricky one to say over and over again. You know, and you can go through and you start to realize, you know, as we, you know, get rid of the lungs of our planet, which are obviously our forests, these incredible, you know, evolutionary sequestration machines, we see a rise in respiratory disorders and allergies and other things, because we're losing those natural filtration systems. And so I could talk forever about all that sort of stuff. But I think, today when we talk about rewilding, I think this what's really beautiful to hear is Ben's talking about, the one end of the rewilding spectrum, which is obviously let nature do what nature does. It's far smarter, far more brilliant, far more innovative than we are, even though we are part of it. But the other end of the spectrum of rewilding is the inner self. And I think, in 2020, Katie, who's on here, who you mentioned, she's sitting there, I can see her. We've been working together for 20 years now. Across a host of projects. We were both respectively locked down in different parts of the world and started collaborating on what it meant not to be able to have access to nature. And as somebody who's really used nature as his, sort of place of work for the last, with the previous 15 years or whatever it was, it really struck me on how inequitable access to nature is. And that phrase, go and get into nature. And often, I was a Patagonia pro for a number of years, and which means you get, a bunch of free outdoor gear. Always makes me laugh because it's always still brightly colored and the most obnoxious sounding material that you walk around like a big turquoise, crinkly human, like, hey, I'm in nature, look at me. But what was amazing was as part of this Patagonia Pro, and I think that's probably where they dumped me because I wrote an article about it. I said, I look at my fellow Patagonia pros and we're all just white men. What a boring perspective to really share this story if it's just through the lens of white men conquering nature, right? So many of us as explorers, it's always like I bagged the mountain and I achieved these incredible feats and look at me.
We did support the first women, Afghan women, to climb Everest. So we actually did a webinar for her a few weeks back to raise funds for her summit.
Yeah, did she summit?
No, she hasn't yet. She sprained her ankle.
You're talking about Freshta.
Yeah, you know her already. Of course, yeah,
we did. We helped mentor her. We put together her program for her. We helped build her website. Yeah, anyway, sorry, but I guess sorry. Exactly. No, but you're totally right. So thank God we have her point of view. Here is a refugee who's living in the UK who wants to be, climbing mountains, and so her point of view is vital and it's inspiring and it's the call of the mountains, but it's also the impossible project, right? The idea that anything is possible. And so being out in nature, having this access to nature and looking at all these things, it really, struck both Kate and myself that this sort of, it is clearly a culture group. It's and for so many, that idea of going out into nature, and I'm talking about this through a very Western perspective, okay? But going out into nature is a luxury, right? It costs a lot. It's not in my culture group. I don't know how to begin. I don't know where to start. And more importantly, I probably don't have time. I'm juggling 3 jobs. I've got kids. I've got all these other things that I need to manage. And then someone's telling me I need to go and, forest bathe like they do in Japan, Shinrin-ku, which is, beautiful, but it's also out there, right? It's miles away. It costs a lot. So we really looked at this and thought there's this real inflection point that was happening in 2020 and that we see right now. And that is that we're dealing with this secret and not so secret, but sometimes we keep it secret pandemic, which is mental health. We see a rise in mental health. There's not a single person on this call who isn't dealing with mental health in their own lives or their family's lives or someone they know is dealing with mental health. And as Ben pointed out, and as we looked at, we said the antidote to mental health is access to nature. And so there is a science to it. And so we launched Rewild Yourself with a focus on creating a global community of rewilders, of people who are organizations, individuals who could effectively, bring together this platform to, bring together a collective sort of inner wildness, right? To sort of really say that, we need to focus on our own wildness, right? We are losing to digital devices. I've lost to my phone. I love to think that I haven't, but I'm on my phone. I'm head down. I'm plugged into some things. I'm sitting next to a plant in the hope that it'll rub off on me and give me some wisdom right now. But it's like, everyone's got their green background savers. But, we really wanted to create this community of well-being that really looks at how we reconnect to nature, to each other. How do we make access to nature more equitable? We wanted to bridge that gap to reunite humans and nature well-being as a really big part of what we were doing. And, today we've been delivering experiences all over the world. We've been creating guides to nature, which is something we're really proud of. If anybody on here has a city they live in, and with I'm going to caveat this because it does need financial support. We've just done one at a well-being.
We can help with that, David.
Yeah,
We can help with
but
the
we've
whole
done New York, we've
process.
done Seoul, we've done Montreal, and it's simple, guys, just to getting out into nature. But we've been launching in 2024. We launched our Rewild Champions again, which is this incredible class of people, who are ultimately out there living the life that we all crave. But more importantly, they're showing us how to live that life in our own. Sorry, I'm still there. Yeah, how to live our own life. My camera's super dirty. Sorry, I was biking quickly to get back this. But how to to rewild ourselves inside of cities. And so we've created partnerships in the recent years with an incredible organization. If you don't know, it's called the Sugi Project, championed by Elise, who's an incredible force of nature. And there's been over 220 odd forests now planted around the world, these microforests. We've actually just started a campaign for Rewild Yourself to plant forests in urban environments. I was actually sitting in one recently, just a minute ago, while Ben started his call. We did one, we got a number in central London. And it's not just the action of planting a forest. It's not just about greening the urban landscape. It's about rewilding the individuals. And it's about getting individuals back into that sense of belonging, that sense of growth. The physical growth you see really helps with the emotional growth. We've actually been, really lucky to partner, with the University of Derby, working on these 5 pathways, which are, beauty, senses, emotion, meaning, and compassion, which there will be a deck going around for you guys to have a look at. But each one of those, right, how we connect with nature and what it actually means, right, to your psyche, your psychological being, it's really, really fundamentally important for us as an organization to create access to nature, to tackle things like mental health. We see crime go down, we see wellness factors and cortisol levels and all these things that Ben touched on go up. And it's not a surprise, but it's making it accessible. I think we spend an inordinate amount of time working on aesthetics and branding. And I think that's really important for us to make it also a beautiful experience and shareable. So we create a huge amount of assets through the Rewild team to really give people the chance to take out education books. We've had incredible response from schools and communities where there's downloadable books for each one of the 5 pathways that you can download. You can customize it as you were, but it's really your journey, and it's your sort of mentor. It's a physical copy. We're trying to build an app, but obviously we want people to get off their phone and all the rest of it. But we created a resource for individuals and communities. So it's looking at it from a different lens, I should say. And I think you are going to see, on average, we're spending 6 to 7 hours a day on mobile devices. We're spending, less than 25 minutes a day outside. It's crazy. Most people go from, a box to a box to a box to eat their lunch out of a box, on a box, on a box, looking at a box, and there is no such thing as a box in nature. So we've got to break that box. And we can only do that if we're fortunate or we find pathways to allow us to access it. So that's really, the sort of the call to action. And for us, who really nature was our playground. It was somewhere where we fundamentally, or as an organization, had grown in, and we just felt it was our need to bring it back to basics and say everybody should share this. Not just a few, not just in the out there mindset, but really reconnecting on a very personal human level. And I think that sort of curiosity towards nature and understanding it and using multimedia. I know I'm shouting at the phone a lot. I'm on a phone, but there are some really cool little apps now. Like, for me, even when I'm walking along, I can take a photograph now of a tree or a leaf, and I can see what's behind it, the information. There might be some medicinal qualities to it. There might be information that I find fascinating that allows me to sink in and understand that. And my kids love that. And so I think there's more tools than ever to use to see the world. But I think the most fundamental tool of all is rewilding our human psyche and getting back into nature. So I'll shut up now in case you
that's incredible, David. I wrote down in bold, rewilding ourselves. I never thought about that, but you're right. The problem is within us. We try to look without, but we have to fix ourselves first. So
and it's
guys,
it's overwhelming, right? It's overwhelming because we're bombarded constantly right? By all sorts of different bits of information. We're constantly bombarded by stuff, and we're, because of it, we're feeling unwell. Society is getting unwell, and I think it really is, if we can take these sacred places, and it can be a park bench, somewhere. It can be a small little community garden that people get to contribute to and eat from. And just the difference between growing your own food and eating it and sharing something like that, the psychological impact is enormous. And I really do think this is something that should be mandated, and it is. And, we are working with a number of organizations in the UK to do that and around the world.
There's a book that I read recently called Thin Places by an Irish author, which I'm going to butcher her name, but you can Google it, Thin Places. But she, she grew up very poor, kind of on the border of the North and the South. And so she would actually just go and experience nature, like even in a parking lot. And she writes very beautifully and poetically about this, about, finding a flower that grows between the cracks of the cement, and like having a moment of reflection with that flower and trying to understand what that means. So it's not that, you're right, like not everyone can take time off or afford to, go out into nature for long periods of time, but we can find it all around us. But without me blathering on too much, I want to give it back to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. Do you guys have any questions? I'm sure you do, for David or Ben.
Yes, I have a question for Ben. This is Simon.
Go ahead, Simon.
Hi, both of you. Thank you very much for what you've said. So as somebody who was raised in an English country village of 250 people, I feel a great kinship for all of this. There are three questions that I'm often asked about rewilding. Firstly, how does one best manage the interface between the rewilded area and the surrounding roads, villages, and conurbations? And then secondly, without natural top predators, is a derrick with a gun truly sufficient to maintain quality, viable populations of prey species? Do we really need to think about the difficult question of having top predators for this to work? And then lastly, I'm in the USA at the moment and spend quite a bit of time in Texas and other places like that. How does one deal with species such as wild hogs in rewilded areas, which I'm aware have become such an out of control problem in many US states and indeed in Europe, due to their fecundity, their tendency to geographically spread, and their omnivorous nature? And you really can't even cull enough of those to keep them under control because they just breed like tops. So some questions for you. Thank you.
So I'll take them quickly in order. So Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the European Commission, in announcing a range of measures to enhance natural capital markets in Europe and harness private finance for nature recovery, talked about the importance of having wild areas next to cultivated or developed ones. And the example she used was that of fruit businesses. If you have a very valuable fruit farm and you're growing apricots or oranges or whatever it is, you need pollinating insects, and pollinating insects require wild, rough nature. So you now have a phenomenon whereby the large fruit growers are paying for the rewilding of neighboring land in order that pollinating insects will make their way into the fruit plantations during flowering season to pollinate those fruits. So that's a perfect example of where streaks and patches and larger core areas of wild land are incredibly important in supporting the agricultural function on more productive land. The productive land needs fresh water, it needs good soil, it needs pollinating insects and other invertebrates, it needs birds in order to control invertebrates. We need nature all around these farmed landscapes. So I think that if you go to Provence in France or you go to Italy, you'll find lots of wild areas interspersed with developed areas. Or Japan. Japan is the best example. They have 22,000 bears in Japan. They've got an island, not just like us here in Britain, and they've thought very carefully about where the wild areas are, where the farmed areas are, and where the towns are. And as a result, they have it all. In terms of predators, I think we definitely need apex predators back. Now, the eastern side of America is a really good example of an ecosystem that is being hollowed out by an overpopulation of deer and other herbivores. Now, you have white-tailed deer and so on literally destroying the forest from within because there's just far too many of them. And then you've got chronic wasting disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which can be passed to humans, by the way. You've got explosion in ticks, explosion in Lyme disease. 10% of people in upstate New York now have Lyme disease. An enormous expansion in the number of road traffic collisions. The whole ecosystem is completely in disequilibrium because they've lost their cougars and they've lost their wolves. So restoring apex predators is really the only way to restore equilibrium. And if you want to see what happens 100 years or 150 years after removing apex predators, go and look at the bleakness of most of the Highlands of Scotland, where the Great Caledonian forests, the great savannas have been utterly depleted, and now it's like a bowling green with contours. No, it's an ecological wreckage, which is now quietly and slowly being rebuilt, but they can't do it without hundreds of millions of pounds worth of fencing to keep the deer out, unless they bring back the wolves. So we've got to have our lynx back, we've got to have wolves back, we've got to learn to live with apex predators. It's a complete lunacy to think that we know better than nature and that we can live without these species. They're vital. And by the way, I don't think we find true harmony with nature unless we find harmony with these species. I think there's something deranged about fully grown men with guns and poison trying to eradicate wolves in Montana or whatever. I think they're mad. Really, I think it's mad. And then finally, invasive species. Yeah, one of the most important things you can do to rewild ecosystems is remove the invasive species. On a continent, that's virtually impossible. So I don't know. I think if you restore ecological balance, restore predators and restore habitats, the natural immunity of the land should return to some degree, and those hogs may get somewhat under control. But the idea that humans can eradicate them, sadly, is a joke. America has spent $160 billion since 1980 trying to eradicate invasive species, and they've never eradicated one. So maybe it would have been better to spend money on restoring habitat, restoring the ecosystem's own immunity. Now, but that's not the case on islands. Removing invasive vertebrates from islands is the biggest bang for your buck in rewilding. Removing rats or goats or pigs from islands restores abundance and vibrancy like nothing else. I'm on the advisory board of island conservation, and that's all they do. They eradicate rats and cats and so on from islands, and that is the biggest bang for your buck in nature, island conservation.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Simon. That was fantastic. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, Adria, I do. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Apologies for my tardiness. Well, I'm clearly and transparently a big fan of Ben's. But I had a question for David, actually. I really love this the website that was shared, Rewild Yourself. It feels like such an incredible like site full of passion, and I'm wondering, do you have plans on doing like a citizen science play as well? I mean, you have all these incredible platforms of people just sharing photos, of species they found, getting help understanding what these species are, and then that being used by scientists for research purposes around the world. And I'm wondering on the rewilding component, especially urban rewilding, so it's much less of a well-charted space. Insights coming in could, emerge to be playbooks, replicable, so fostering a sense of community, but also really helping, even the establishment understand how to do rewilding properly.
Yeah, I'm 100% in line with what you're saying there. In terms of, I think there's as many tools as we can possibly layer on to experiences. I think the fundamental tool that we're trying to unlock is human potential, right? And it's just the community, and that's what it comes back to, right? There is something about this connection. We're living in a world where most people are afraid to walk down the street. Very few people actually interact with strangers anymore. Very few people, smile at people anymore, right? We're living in a world that's full of fear and fragmentation, right? We're told to hate somebody because they don't look like us or talk like us or dress like us. And so I think what we want to get back to, first and foremost, at a very basic level, is human connection, is community, is building a resilience in the community that says, I share this with you, I share this common place, I share this common understanding. And then undoubtedly, layering in educational tools, layering in citizen science. There's some incredible, there's one I saw recently, which is really worth looking at. I think it's one of the best new, citizen science projects that I've seen in a long time. It's called eBio Atlas. I'm not sure if anybody's aware of it, but it's a very simple, started by a scientist, and it's really simple. You basically get sent a syringe, and any type of waterway that's near you. From I live right near the Thames. You can plug it in. You put it on. You spurt a bit of water through onto a disc. You pop it in a prepaid envelope back to them. They run it through a machine, that will tell you every single species that is in your catchment, in your water catchment. So instead of having to sit there and count the number of birds, the number of species, which is often, what scientists do ad nauseum, you can literally pick up on all of the DNA from all these different species, now using AI to sort it, tell you what's what, if there's new species there. So, there are a lot of tools now that are super available. And as I said, just even back to your phone, right? We work very closely with the Natural History Museum. They're one of our key partners in London. I always love that they have a desk there where you can bring a species in and you can show them what it is and they'll identify it. It's just all of that, I think, adds, to the story. At the end of the day, nature is the greatest storyteller. She has the greatest stories to tell and show if we're willing to look, if we're willing to slow down, look and listen, if we're willing to, look at the cracks in the pavement and see that growth. If we're willing to not just look, I blame what I call nature pornography. Like, I love Attenborough. He's a fucking miracle of a man. I mean, he's 98 years old, but he is the sort of, he's the, the Ron Jeremy of nature, of nature. That's a really bad analogy, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like, nature porn, it was no one ever thought I would say that, but I did. But it's like, and here we are in front of this massive whale breaching. Someone sat for 4 years to wait for that moment. And so people go out into nature and they're like, where the fuck are my whales, man? Where is my eagle grabbing a mountain goat? Nature's positively fucking boring. It's nature pornography that we've all become obsessed by. Number one thing on television, nature. Number one thing on Instagram, nature. But we love it. And now what's scary is it's AI generated. I don't even need to go into nature. I can just get my fix from a telephone. So we need to slow down and look at the really simple, small, beautiful things that actually make make a huge difference to the whole cycle of life, which we are. We are a tiny little speck inside of that web of life. And so for me, I think there are a lot of great tools. Citizen science is a no-brainer. It's something we need. Nobody's as smart as everybody is a slogan we've used for a long time. Sorry about my crap analogy. I love Attenborough. He's awesome.
But I'd like to just add to David's point here. I accept what David says, although we've lost touch with an abundance that our grandparents and great-grandparents considered normal. So I think in a world that is hyper-abundant, skies that used to darken with migrating birds, for example, or, wetlands that sang with frogs such that you couldn't hear yourself think. I think these enormous herds of elephants, you see photos from the 1950s of enormous herds of elephants in East Africa. I think if you restore massive abundance, then nature becomes more entertaining up close. And then the second point is the habituation of nature to fear us. I think lots of people in lots of places in the past used to live in landscapes where nature wasn't frightened of us. If you go to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the horses and the deer, they don't run away from humans. Birds will land on your arm, and butterflies land on your face. And here in England, wildlife is so terrified of humans because we are so brutal to wildlife that everything hides from us at the slightest sound. And I think that's something that's been stolen from us by people who have an unhealthy relationship with nature. This habituation of wildlife to fear us. Go to the Galapagos or some of these other places and experience what it's like to be in a land where nature isn't afraid of people, and you have a whole different perspective.
Wow, I got chills as you were talking. That's incredible. And then Sangeeta, by the way, just messaged in the chat and she invited us. She's part of one of the royal families in India, wants us to come visit her. So Sangeeta, we will take you up on that offer because they have a lot of land.
I just want to say, because I have to actually leave because I unfortunately have to jump up.
Oh yeah, that's right. You had to leave
I did. So I just wanted to say it's been a real honor. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Adriana, for putting this together. Thank you, Katie, for supporting me in the team of Rewilding, and everyone who I can't see. Thank you for being here. I hope you rewild yourself some small way. And any support is always welcome. You can find us on Voice for Nature. .com and our foundation, I'm sure will circulate. But I really do appreciate this opportunity. So
Thanks, David. We'll talk soon. Take care.
thanks,
We
everyone.
look forward to having you all over a 4-day summit in a forest in India.
Yeah,
Yes,
we would
please.
love to come.
This needs to be explored, Mr. David. This really needs to be explored further and shared.
100%. Does anybody have any more questions for Ben? Because we still have a few minutes.
Ben, thank you. Adria, thank you. I just was wondering if Ben could just read to me at story time and tell me about animals and his accent and all the species and all the big words and all of that. So that you may need a podcast just reading to people about your love of animals because
I have a podcast. I've just put it in the chat.
I saw that. But if it doesn't have bedtime stories with Ben, we need to add that. So that would be really good.
He's very relaxed. It's very relaxing to listen to, Ben. Like I'm
so
excited
kind.
to listen to the podcast. So, and we'll promote it in our newsletter because it goes out to 11,000 people. So happy
Oh my
to
God, that's so
share.
kind of you.
Yeah, of course. If you guys have anything, the Vine members, a newsletter is always exciting because you guys are all doing incredible things. So we like to consider it a collective of sharing, the goodness that we're all up to. So please feel free to share.
And I'll add two other quick things. I was in San Francisco yesterday going to the airport and a coyote runs across in front of me and then another coyote runs across in front of me. And so coyotes are a part of San Francisco's wildlife now, after COVID and all that, which I'm just adding to the conversation. And then lastly, when was the last time people took off their rubber shoes and put their feet in dirt? And I know I mean, we have rubber shoes on concrete and we live as humans and we wonder why we're not connected to the earth anymore. And it's something as simple as that I just like to always be a champion of take your shoes off.
I was involved in structuring the new farm subsidy regime here in the UK, where we now pay farmers only to the extent that they're delivering stewardship and restoration of nature and ancillary activities. You don't just get subsidized for being a farmer anymore. It's like the end of pork barrel, to take an American term, and the beginning of public money for public good. And one of the options that farmers can take is £200 per farm visit they do for schools, but they're specifically called forest school visits. So you have to have a wild place on your farm, and then kids come and they spend 2 hours effectively playing in nature, and then they go back to school, and you get paid £200. So a lot of farmers and their families are now doing this and creating wild places on their farm and then bringing kids in. And one farmer's wife told me that these kids have never had their hands in the soil before. Like they don't even know what it is to touch mud. They're squeamish. They don't want to. And it takes about half an hour, she said, before they're doing rough and tumble on the riverside, falling in the water, picking stuff up, getting mud in their hands. And I think this is it's hidden within the small print of the farm subsidy regime, but I think it's a huge win.
Sorry.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, Yvonne, do you have a quick question? We still have a few minutes left. Go ahead.
That was the question I wanted to share, that I had an environmental landscaping business in the 80s when it wasn't cool. I'm sorry, I'm off camera. And we used to transform traditional landscape into edible landscapes. And even though we were in one of the most rural, mixed parishes in Louisiana, very upscale, but mixed, when we would have people, when we would create a backyard garden, like an edible wild garden, people wouldn't touch their peaches off their little trees because it just seemed weird to pull a fruit off a tree and actually eat it. And many of the children who were living in relatively rural neighborhoods didn't know where apples came from, or that you could pick an apple off a tree or eat berries off a bush. So it was really fascinating.
Agri-wilding.
Yes.
Yeah, it's shocking. We need to be teaching this in schools. I'm going to do another shameless drop for Ben. So since I saw you last time, you wrote a book, right?
Yeah, I did. I wrote a book.
Yeah. That happened after we met. I didn't know about it until now.
I mean, part of my kind of I've always been passionately interested in wildlife and nature, but part of the fervor of the last kind of 5 years of this is I lost my daughter here in Somerset. We had a disaster. She was a real bright little star called Iris, 15 and a half years old, turned a vehicle on top of herself. No one was around. And so we suffered the catastrophe that really everyone who has kids dreads. And yeah, being close to nature was really my survival kit. Like, it's really hard to describe the darkness that envelops you when such a thing happens. And I just found that being outside and beginning this rewilding of our land, because I'd had this land for 10 years earlier and I'd never been brave enough to actually do full on rewilding. And Iris was a little wild child. She was there on her pony galloping through the woods. She spent all her time with her friends in the wilder corners of the farm. And so really, as a kind of love letter for her, it's, almost in a spiritual sense, like she's doing it with me kind of thing. We just ripped out all the fencing. I just got to work and rewilded the whole place. And yeah, I wrote a book about this experience. I was going to write quite a technical book about how to rewild Britain. And if you look at my book is really structured that way, what are the key things we need to do? But it's not. It's a spiritual it's a book of love and loss and solace in nature. It's a very personal story. So I wrote a book. I named it for a quirky reason. It's not a theological book, by the way, but it has a quirky name. It's called God is an Octopus. And there is a kind of punchline as to why it's called God is an Octopus. But I wrote that book and I didn't know I was going to get it published, but I did send it to Bloomsbury and then it sort of took off and has sold like crazy. But I didn't have myself down as an author.
Wow.
I wrote it in the UAE when I escaped the lockdowns with my kids and found myself in
the meeting you was that day was quite magical. I mean, he the way you walked up to me, he kind of looked like Indiana Jones. You had this like beautiful linen outfit on, and the people were praying in the background, and then we had a really beautiful chat, and I think we talked about energy. And then I think I remember saying to you that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. And then after that, I had a friend call me from the US she was having a really hard time and she was losing her visa and she was going to get kicked out of the US. And then I said a prayer for her on the phone. And then in this place, because they were praying in the background, and then we prayed for her. And then I ended up getting her visa sorted out from a Vine member. And it was a very beautiful day. It was I don't know, meeting Ben that day was magical to me, and I never forgot about it. So I'm really grateful for you to share your story with us, and I'm definitely going to read your book. And
I'm going to show you one thing. I'm going to hold one thing up to the screen.
Yeah.
So I gave my girl Iris, I gave her an iPhone too young. She would have been 12 or something, maybe 13. And she died 3 years later. But I gave her this phone, and I just want to illustrate for you how deep her own love of nature was, because she hopped off her pony to film this for me. It's just a tiny clip, which I treasure. Hold on, if you can see the screen. Oh, wait, let's get away. Okay, hold on. You hear, but listen to the joy in her voice. Hold on.
We've had a right by the sun. I'll get inside. And look, they're going up. Look how giant that is. I was right next to them.
Oh, wow.
So you can see she would have loved what we're doing here with our rewilding of our land.
It's amazing. I've only seen starlings fly like that once in my life, and it's an incredible experience. So, and I am going to Rome after this, so I guess that's common for them to do it in the summertime. I'd love to see it. Anyway, I know everyone has to go.
Thank you all so much.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I'm grateful to you and to David. And we'll be in touch again soon. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Vine members. Love you guys.
Bye-bye.